I'm going to sit down today. I'm deliberately sitting down because I know when I walk about and talk, I point my fingers and I do all of this. And one of the challenges with that is that it ends up something I just say, because Glenn thought it, he might have read a bit, but he just says, becomes something that you hear as authoritative as something else that I say that maybe came from the Bible. And today there's a lot of, here's a thought Glenn had, as opposed to, this is straight out of the Bible. Because last week we spent our time talking about Sabbath, as in what does the Bible have to say about it, and we looked at three main passages. We looked at Genesis 2, where we see God resting. We looked at Exodus 20, where we see God include rest as part of the Ten Commandments. And then the third one was in Mark 2, where we see Jesus saying that I am the Lord of the Sabbath, that Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. And so we looked at those three passages in turn and said, what can we say about each of them? And we tried to explore maybe what Sabbath might be. And one of the pastors that I quoted last week that I found quite helpful, he has a little section towards the end of his material on that. He said, if you're going to talk about this in your church, people will get annoyed with you more than any other subject. He said, you could talk about sexuality. People won't get as annoyed with you about that as they will when you start talking about Sabbath. And I was like, what a lot of nonsense. Well, it's been an interesting week. It's fascinating. And it feels to me a little bit like, oh, maybe we've poked something that matters a little bit. And people are, no, I don't like that. I don't want that. I'm not having that. That's no good. You said this, that's not right. To which my first response was, no, I don't think I did say that. But anyway. So what did we say last week? I want to look at it different. Last week we did Genesis 2, Exodus 20, Mark 2. But if we cut across them this way, rather than the straight up and down way, there are three things that I want us to remember from there. So the first is that Sabbath is a gift, not a burden. Okay? Sabbath is a gift, not a burden. Across all three of those. Genesis 2, it's a gift to humanity. We begin in rest. Mark 2, Sabbath is not made for man, but man for the Sabbath. So Sabbath is a gift to us, it's not a burden. That this is about human dignity, that we actually live the fullest of lives by having a rhythm like this in our lives. And then the third thing is that it's holy. Sabbath is set, it's the only thing named in all creation that's holy. And that it's something set aside, set apart, it's different, it's other, it's not normal. And yet, it's also about this place of worship and recognizing that God is the one who has given it to us. So if those things are generally true, and are we happy to say that the Bible says that? Does anybody want to have an argument with me about that? That's fine, okay, good. Then I guess the question then comes, well, okay, so we live not as those who are wandering in the desert, as a kind of semi-nomadic people. We don't live as people living in agrarian first century ancient Near Eastern culture. We live in 21st century, we live in Edinburgh, in Scotland, in the West with this, all that means. What does it mean for us to bring the notion of Sabbath into our lives and try and figure that out? And one simple answer would be that we become kind of a community that removes itself from the rest of the world and says we're going to live entirely by our own rules and our own rhythms, and we're going to ignore the rest of the world. So the most extreme version of that would be something like the Amish that you might see in North America, who have their own rules and rhythms, and they don't use any technology and all of those kinds of things. And that's the most extreme. We're going to live in this way. And we could choose to do something like that. I mean, it'd be a bit weird in Portobello, but actually probably people in Portobello would quite like that. Some little weird community that live by themselves and go and sit on the beach and be nice to one another or something. I don't know. But assuming that we're not going to do that, and that we're going to continue to somehow live lives where we're called as people who are salt and light in the world, sent out from this place of community, what does it look like for us to embrace some of this notion of Sabbath as discipline, but also as recognizing that it's something God's called us to? So all that I'm going to suggest from here are just that, suggestions, not rules. It seemed to me that it's important that we keep reminding ourselves that as Christians we're not under law in this matter. This is gift to us. It's a gift that might be useful in our lives, that might help us live more alive in the way that Jesus talks about in John 10. Most importantly, it might help us orient all of our lives, the entirety of our lives, towards pursuing God and finding our true meaning in Him. Sabbath is a gift that God gives us, not a list of rules to follow. Okay? I'm super emphasizing that because I know what's going to happen. I'm going to make all these suggestions and people are going to say, but you said that that was what we should do. And I'm not saying that's what we should do. I'm suggesting to you that there are some things that we might embrace that could be helpful. And we need to discern together. And you need to discern in your life how that might work out. I said last week, this is probably one of the hardest things I've struggled with in my entire life. Like, I don't find this easy at all, partly because of the way I'm wired, partly because of the job I have, partly because of, just be honest, sin, right? That's what it is, sin. So that's me. I know you're all super holy and that's not a problem for any of you, but let's just imagine for a moment that it might be, and we'll see where we go. We're going to look at three different areas today. The first, Sabbath at the level of the individual. The second, Sabbath at the level of the household. And then third, Sabbath at the level of the church. We'll spend more time on the first one than on the other two because that's just how I've written it. So don't freak out when you're like, man alive, he's hardly started and we're running out of time. And then we're going to round up. And I'm going to try, this could be a disaster, but I'm going to try and do a bit of a thought experiment at the end that takes an idea and says, well, let's work this out in my life, or you can try and do it in your own life. So that's where we're going. Okay, so the first, individual. The Sabbath rhythms have to be embraced at the level of an individual, right? I mean, you have to choose to embrace this. But the reality is, even those ones will probably require some teamwork with the people that are around you in your life. So what are these individual things that we could do? Well, the first and the most obvious is stop work, okay? Just stop work. It's the core of God's invitation to rest. Genesis 2, Exodus 20, they both reference either God stopped work, and then we had it, or Exodus 20, we stopped work. So there is something about embracing Sabbath that requires us to simply stop work. Okay, so this isn't about trying to cheat around the edge and say, well, I've got a quieter day this week, or whatever. No. Sabbath requires the stopping of work. I am not indispensable for a 24-hour period in the week. Okay? The wheels don't come off the world. Nothing will end up falling apart. It will be fine. Now, here's the thing. If you are thinking Sabbath has to be a Sunday, and I think for most people it's a good idea for Sabbath to be a Sunday, but for many people, Sabbath can't be a Sunday. So I'm a good example of that. I work on Sundays. Like, I'd be delighted to not work on a Sunday, but that doesn't really work. Leslie has to do on-call on Sundays. Sometimes that's because people are sick and she needs to look after them. Jonathan does on-call on Sundays because people are sick. Some people's work rhythms mean you have to work a Sunday either from time to time or quite regularly. Many in the caring profession, that's the case. There are people not here today who are part of our church community, and the reason they're not here is because they're caring for others. And so does that mean they can't have Sabbath? No, because we don't live under law, we live under grace, and so Sabbath can be another day in the week, if that's the case. It takes deep intentionality to do that and not just lose it in the ether. And it will inevitably look different if you can't gather with your church family on the Sabbath. But it does mean that we can then begin to embrace different kinds of rhythms and say, well, okay, Sabbath matters to me. I can't do Sunday. What am I going to do? And we begin to become intentional about it. And that's another word I want us to grab hold of here, is intentionality, being deliberate about it. I don't think Sabbath happens properly by accident. So you might end up having Sundays as a place where you generally don't have to work, and you come to church most weeks, and you call that Sabbath. Fine, but I also think you're missing something because it's just happening by accident. You're not intentionally saying, no, I'm going to embrace the fact I have stopped work. I'm going to find some space for rest, and we'll talk about some of the positive things we can do in a moment. But I am going to intentionally think of this as my Sabbath time, my set-aside time, this holy time, this gift from God to me. So we have this, and it seems to me, this is one of the conversations I've had this week, it seems to me that the scriptures always envisage a 24-hour period. And I realize some people say, well, it doesn't really work. I'd like to do like a 6-hour Sabbath or whatever. Look, 6 hours is better than nothing. But I think the Bible envisages a 24-hour period. I think that's what we see. And so I think deciding that we're going to try and carve out 24 hours, call it Sabbath, find this time for rest, is a really helpful thing for us to do. So that's the stopping work part. And I do wonder if this stopping idea should be understood more widely than simply the work that we're paid for. There are other things that have significant hold of our time. Technology, our phones, it's down there, our TV, our social media use. I don't know what it is for you. That if we were to look across the week and say, what is the thing that has hold of my time? That maybe I could find a chance to stop from and to rest from. That would be a good thing to encourage as part of this idea of stopping doing something, stopping work in particular. But maybe this thing that has hold of our time would be a good thing to do. Tim Keller says this. He says, Sabbath means you are not a slave, not to your culture's expectations, your family's hopes, your work's demands, not even to your own insecurities. Sabbath means you are not a slave. And so anything that seems to grab us in that direction, I do wonder if it's something that we ought to embrace as something that we can lay down and stop. So there's the first thing as an individual. We stop something, predominantly work, but perhaps I want to suggest to you some other things might be useful. Sleep. I talked a little bit about this last week. We have a daily rhythm of rest, okay? If we're healthy and well as human beings, we have a daily rhythm of rest. We sleep at regular periods. Those with young kids, that period is usually slightly different than what it looks like for others. At different periods in our life, that will be different. But if we are well and healthy and life is normal, then we will be able to have some sleep. I said last week, it's our place of deepest vulnerability. We have no control. We let go of control of our lives, and we lay down, we close our eyes, and we say, what is going to happen? And I want to read to you from this book. Anybody remember this book? Such a big change. But if you were with us at the beginning of COVID, we went through this book. It's called Liturgy of the Ordinary by a woman called Tish Harrison Warren. And it's brilliant. And if you're looking for a little book to kind of help your devotional life or help you think about where God is in the very ordinary, mundane things of your life, I'd strongly recommend this. Somebody can borrow this one at the end if you want. And basically what she does is she goes through just an ordinary day and says, what would it look like for God to invade this part of my life? And she comes towards the end and she talks about Sabbath rest. She writes these words. In Jewish culture, days begin in the evening with the setting of the sun. We see this in Genesis 1 with the repetition of, and there was evening and there was morning. So this is the beginning of the day. The day begins with rest. We start by settling down and going to sleep. So this mirrors the fact that humans are created in day 6 and then day 7 is the Sabbath day. So there's a mirror in the daily rhythm that mirrors this Sabbath idea. The understanding of time, or this understanding of time, is powerfully reorienting, even jarring to those of us who measure our days by our own efforts and accomplishments. The Jewish day begins in seemingly accomplishing nothing at all. We begin by resting, drooling on our pillow, dropping off into helplessness. I know you all drool on your pillows. For the avoidance of doubt, I don't do such a thing. Eugene Peterson, she says this, the Hebrew evening-morning sequence conditions us to the rhythms of grace. We go to sleep, and God begins his work. Though the day begins in darkness, God is still at work, growing crops, healing wounds, giving rest, protecting, guarding, mending, redeeming. We drop out of consciousness, but the Holy Spirit remains at work. In his brief theology of sleep, Scottish pastor John Bailey writes that in Christ we wake up better people than we went to sleep. If it is hard for us to believe that God is at work in us and in the world even while we sleep, it reveals who we truly think is the mover and maker of our lives and spiritual health. And so the decision to sleep, now I'm a night owl. I would love to stay up late. I don't really know why. It's generally not very helpful. Like everybody else is sleeping, you can't achieve much. But I love to stay up late. And I do wonder if it's deeply related to my habit of feeling like I need to be in control of things. Because by going to sleep, I relinquish all control. I can't do anything. Nothing happens while I'm sleeping, apart from the odd snore. Only the odd one. I have a sign by my bed that says, I'm not snoring, I'm dreaming, I'm a motorbike. We go to sleep, and it requires us to have faith that God is still at work, that God is still good and makes a difference. Sabbath is the same. If we rest from doing things, if we enter into that weekly rhythm that's just like our daily rhythm, then it requires us to have faith that God is still at work, that the wheels won't fall off, and that he is in control. It begins to fundamentally change our posture in the world. So sleep. I also think sleep is a great thing on Sabbath, like an afternoon nap. There is little in the world like an afternoon nap. It's just a gift, wonderful gift. I'm not seeing the love for an afternoon nap in the room here. That's a disappointment. But sleep is important. Another individual habit is to make space. So don't fill your life, don't fill your Sabbath with stuff. Okay, so I've got a Sabbath today. I'm going to get up, I'm going to read the Bible for an hour and a half. I'm then going to pray for 2.5 hours. That means I've got another 5 hours left till I have to make dinner. Right, those 5 hours, I'm going to go for a walk for 3 hours of them. I'm then going to go for a cycle, and then I'm going to have a nice long shower after. And you fill it up. Leave some space. One of the great things in our world today, or the greatest challenges in our world today, is that it's noisy all the time. It's always busy. There's always something going on. And we lack the capacity for boredom. There's a whole movement among bringing kids up now that we have to try and train them to be bored. No, you can't have an iPad. No, you can't have, just be bored for a little bit. And what happens when kids are bored? What? No, I'm asking, what happens when kids are bored? Exactly. It's the space of creativity. And we begin to see other things come forth. So on your Sabbath, make space to be bored. Like a simple thing. Just don't fill up your whole day. Make space to be bored and see what happens. The other thing about creating space is that we begin to learn that, oh, wait a minute, I don't need to massively overprogram my life. I can build margin and capacity in. That there is space then to be able to say, oh, I could have dinner with these people. They could come on Sabbath for dinner. That would be a good thing, because I have some space that isn't completely pre-programmed. Now, I'm speaking to you about this like I know what I'm talking about. This is a nightmare for me. This is by far and away my worst thing. I was at one point going to put a screenshot of my calendar for the next month on there. I was embarrassed. Can't do it as an example like this. There's no margin. It's full. It's ridiculous. So I am speaking to myself here, and if it is marginally useful for you, then I hope that that's good. So create space in your individual Sabbath. That's up to you. Make it work. And then this last thing, and I think this is the most important, perhaps the most important one of all, is what brings you joy? What brings you joy? I'm going to read you a little section of a book by Eugene Peterson, who talks about his practice of Sabbath. Now, he, like me, was a pastor. He didn't have Sabbath on a Sunday. He did it on a Monday. And so he writes what he did. And it's all related to joy. What did he and his wife enjoy to do? And this is what he writes. Monday is my Sabbath. Nothing is scheduled for Mondays. There are emergencies, I respond, but there are surprisingly few. My wife joins me in observing the day. We make a lunch, put it in a day pack, take our binoculars, and drive anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour away to a trailhead along a river or into the mountains. Before we begin our hike, my wife reads a psalm and prays. After that prayer, there is no more talking. We enter into a silence that will continue for the next 2 or 3 hours until we stop for lunch. We walk leisurely, emptying ourselves, opening ourselves to God's beauty in nature. When the sun or our stomachs tell us it's lunchtime, we break the silence with a prayer of blessing for the sandwiches and fruit, the river and the forest. We are free to talk now. We return home in the middle of or late afternoon, putter around, do odd jobs, read. After supper, I usually write family letters. That's it. No Sinai thunder, no Damascus Road illuminations, no Patmos visions. A day set apart for solitude and silence, not doing, being there. The sanctification of time and filled with joy. Now, that day wouldn't particularly, to be honest, fill me with joy. It's not my bag. Silence and solitude, not my place. But he's an introvert. For him, that was a big deal. What brings you joy? It may not be what Eugene's just described, but what brings you joy? I'm going to leave an uncomfortable amount of silence because I want you to sit with that question for yourself. What brings you joy? Not what brings your family joy, what brings your friends joy, what brings the person sitting next to you joy? What brings you joy? Okay. Anyone find that difficult? Did everybody just go straight into your head? You're like, I know the thing that brings me joy. Yeah? Okay. So, whatever it is that brings you joy should form part of your Sabbath. Unless, of course, your answer was my work. In which case you've got a problem. Not that you can't have joy in your work, but that's going to be a challenge if you're going to do Sabbath. The things that bring us joy are the things that, as we individually approach Sabbath, are the things that we should look to bring into that. Okay, that's enough about the individual. Let's look at household. So I've used this word because I didn't want to use the word family. And the reason I didn't want to use the word family is because not everybody's in a family setup, and also because when we use the word family, we almost always end up defaulting to the idea of the nuclear family. Husband, wife, and 2.4 kids, although I think it's less than 2.4 these days, but whatever. That's the family unit. And the Bible doesn't, or the New Testament doesn't think of family like that. This is our family, right? Jesus says, who are my mothers and my brothers and sisters? These, the ones who do the will of my Father. That actually there's a real challenge to us, I think, to say that we must not just think of this as family. So think about our household, the people we live with, but also, we're going to say a little bit about this, is that we don't want to just say that's it and we exclude everyone else. I think we want to be, if we're going to embrace these rhythms, then we want to be open at the edges and bring others into it. So, the reason it's helpful as a household is you can begin to develop some rhythms and patterns of the way that you function together, beyond just as individuals. So you have habits and markers. The Jewish tradition's really good on this stuff, like really, really strong. So they have all sorts of different habits and practices that they would do. One of the ones that I think is beautiful is that the woman of the house lights a candle at the start of Sabbath on a Friday night, and that's the marker as they sit down at the table. They light a candle, and that's the marker of what happens. But we can have all sorts of other markers to say this is the beginning of our Sabbath. I have an acquaintance who they have a box in their house that they open on a Friday night, and they put their phones in it, and they close the box, and the phones all go away for 24 hours. That's them marking that Sabbath has begun. We did one that's very not holy, but so we used to, on a Friday evening, we would do what we called Fizzy Friday. This was the marker. We were finished work, we'd put it down. So Karen gets a gin and tonic, I got a beer, and Zoe used to get a Sprite. Fizzy Friday, that was the marker of the start of our Sabbath, from Friday evening until Saturday evening. Some people use a particular prayer at dinner on a Friday night. It just says, or on a Sunday morning over breakfast, or whenever your Sabbath is, that there's a rhythm and a repeated thing that we do because it's helpful for us. That says, I'm marking this as a moment that is something different. So habits, markers can be really useful to us in households as we think about what it looks like. We then have the whole family idea. And again, as I said, it's not the nuclear family. We have to expand it. But it means, how do we involve children in this? I've not mentioned children at all. If you're a caregiver to a young person, you can't take a Sabbath from that. There's no going, right, you're 2 now, you can look after yourself for 24 hours, you'll be fine, just didn't touch the oven. Instead, we have to recognize that if we're going to do these things as a whole family, that we involve the whole family, that we find ways for them to engage in the process. And that can be fun, right? It doesn't need to be, right, now's the time that you're all going to be miserable for 24 hours, no TV, no nothing. What brings them joy? And what if you could figure that out and then say, right, every week, as a family, we find this space to have joy. It could be board games. It could be going a walk as a family. It could be any number of things. it allows you to be together as a household and to embrace that, but also to recognize the gift of this space. There's no demand of work. There's no demand of we have to be here or there, but actually there's time together. And I think there's a strong biblical tradition of hospitality. And so I think there is a space, as we think about Sabbath, to be the people who are welcoming of, in inverted commas, the other. So to bring other people to your table and to have folks sit with you and eat with you on Sabbath, I think is just a brilliant habit to have. I know for us as a family, that's probably been one of the greatest gifts we've had, is people who've come to our table and invested in our family simply by their presence. So I know Zoe would talk a lot about young women that would have come and been part of our, some lived with us for a while, but often just would come and sit at our table and eat with us regularly. And the influence that has over her, just seeing people who are older than her, who are not her parents, that actually have, that love Jesus and want to embrace those kinds of things, that have found a space in the world for themselves. There's a gift that we give to ourselves as we give the gift of hospitality to others. And I think Sabbath makes space for that. I do think we all in the 21st century have to ask the question, what's the role of technology in our families? And that's as broad as technology you want to be. But technology is a gift to us. Don't want to become Luddites and start yelling about it all. But it also comes with its pressures. And anything that comes to us as pressure that would be something we can't control is something we become a slave to. And as I said at the beginning, one of the purposes of Sabbath is we're not slaves. So it's not for me to tell you what the role of technology should be in your family, because lots of families or households, it would be like Sabbath. We're going to watch a movie this afternoon, and that's a happy place. That'd be a good thing to do. So don't hear me saying you shouldn't have any technology, but to what might have you enslaved, what might be grabbing hold of you too much. And we know that technology is definitely part of that. Last one on this. Intentional reflection. It's back to, as individuals, we need to make intentional decisions in order to be able to make these things happen. I think in the household setting, asking some intentional reflective questions can be really, really helpful. Where has God been in your life this week? Simple question to ask over dinner. And, depending on how old your kids are, you'll either get a really interesting answer like, I saw ants this week, they were great. Or you get, not much. And that very much depends on how old your kids are. But engaging with this idea of asking the question, where is God in our life? What has he been doing? You could be much more intentional and, write a prayer that you're going to use every week. You could borrow one from somewhere else. Stephen Crothers, who was here for our church weekend last year, Stephen's church, once a quarter put out what they call a table liturgy. So they write a liturgy that you can use at the table, and they use it sometimes in their small groups, and sometimes they use it in families. But the idea is there's an invitation to be able to embrace a habit and an intentional reflection as part of Sabbath. Last one, church. How are we shaped by Sabbath rhythms? Good question. I mean, we're here every Sunday morning. You're welcome to come. 11 o'clock, it's great. But I do think this should challenge us, and we're going to have a conversation a little bit as a leadership team on tomorrow evening to say, is there anything here we should be doing to help people and to help us as a community to embrace Sabbath rhythms? We certainly do want to keep it holy, and we recognize it's why we worship, it's why we give time to singing and to prayers and to all of those kinds of things that matters to us as a church. But I do think profoundly church is about annual rhythms as well. We talked last week about how these rhythms of church are not just, rhythms of Sabbath, are not simply the weekly rhythm of Sabbath, but actually there are other rhythms. So the land gets a rest every 7 years. We've talked today about sleep, and so there's these habits of rest that are built into the week. And so I think as a church, we need to embrace annual rhythms. So this next slide, this isn't us as a church, but the church calendar, I think fascinatingly models out like this. And you'll notice all the green space, right? Is that most of the church calendar year is actually ordinary time, right? Nothing fancy happening. There's nothing big happening. And we have the big celebrations. We have Easter and Advent and Christmas and all of these things and Lent that we want to embrace and have habits and practices around, and we want to celebrate and do all the good things. But you know what? Most of the year is just ordinary. It's just dead ordinary. That's good news to me, because most of my life is just dead ordinary. There's nothing fancy about it. So I think as a church, we could pop that away now, that's fine. But as a church, as we think about what it means to have Sabbath, we actually want to embrace like longer rhythms. What does it look like? So last summer, we tried adjusting the time of our summer service. That was controversial. It was loved or hated, and nothing in between. And the reason we did that was to try to create a different rhythm. And we have intentionally, and we'll do the same again this year, our services in the summer will be much more simple. Way less people involved, so that we can just embrace the fact that we want to slow down a little. And you know, we don't get a lot of sun in this country. So when we do, let's enjoy it. Let's get outside and embrace a different habit and rhythm. And so we want to think well about what that is. And I think we will probably have an item on our church meeting in March that gives us the chance to have a bit of a conversation. Anybody got any ideas? I am not the oracle of good ideas on this, and heaven knows the leadership team aren't either. So we will see what everyone else... That was a joke. That really didn't work very well. Okay, moving on. I'll be in trouble for that one. So just to say that at the level of a community, we want to think about this. I can see loads of you looking at that picture going, where did we get that from? There was a wee man took a drone picture the other week. I thought, well, that's quite cool. We'll use that. Some of you are going, what state's the roof in? But anyway. Okay. I'm going to finish by working through a quick idea. I've spoken for far too long. I'm sorry. I talked last week about the idea of not causing someone else to work. Would that be something we'd want to think about? There's no doubt that's the most controversial thing I said last week. It wasn't even in my notes. It was a little sideline idea. Wish I'd never said it. People have been yelling at me all week about it. So let's do a thought experiment. Why would we take a decision to try and not cause others to work? So as I've thought about it this week, I think there are two paths we can go down. The first is a justice path, right? The first is a path that says, no, I just don't believe that it's right that people are forced to work on a Sunday. That actually we should have, we absolutely should, just as a question of justice, I can't embrace a system that says that people have to work on a Sunday as par for the course. And so I want to take, as part of my Sabbath, a justice stance that says I'm not going to do that. Now look, let's just be honest. Even if we all did it in here, Tesco don't care, right? They're still going to open on a Sunday, that kind of thing. And somebody said to me, oh, but like if we, like you might, all the shops in Porty might end up having to close on a Sunday. And I was like, well, that would be a good thing probably, I think, if we think of this justice question. So there's one way to think of it that is just, this is an issue of justice. No, I'm going to make a stand that says I don't want anybody to have to work on a Sunday because it's a question of justice. I want everyone to have this good thing that God gives as a Sabbath. And I think that that's a good thing for us to have, and we want to stand against that. And I think you can take that position and make a really good case for it. But as I've thought about it last week, the one I find more compelling is this other thought. So when I require someone to work for me on a Sabbath day, Sunday or whatever day it is, the day that I have my Sabbath, when someone has to work for me, it means I'm consuming something, right? So I'm shopping, I'm going to my gym, whatever someone has to work for, I'm consuming. We're going to exclude health emergencies from this, right? Because everybody always comes up with, but what if I have a heart attack? Well, you're free to go to the hospital and see Jonathan. Jonathan will fix you on any day of the week that he's working, right? So excluding those, if I require something at work, I'm generally consuming something. Could I take a break from that? I have 6 days on which I consume. Could I have a 7th day in which I chose not to consume? So this is now no longer about the person who has to work to serve me, but actually this is now about my heart. Could I choose to take a break from consumption for a day? Now, would that be costly? Well, it would, because I've built my life around just getting what I want, when I want, whenever I need it. So I'd have to give some things up. So I used the example of I might have to say I can't go to the gym on my Sabbath day. So if I want exercise, I have to do something that doesn't involve that would be costly to me. It would mean I couldn't go to a restaurant on that day. I'd have to do that on another day, a separate time. It would be costly. But I think it would also require deep intentionality. So there'd be no nipping to the shops for the milk that I forgot, or the meal I'm cooking and I've forgotten that I needed, I don't know, chickpeas. I've got no chickpeas in the cupboard. Instead, I'd have to be organized. And I talked a little bit about this last week, and this I think has become quite helpful for me as I've thought about it. Sabbath doesn't happen by accident. I need to plan for it and prepare for it. And certainly if I made the decision I wasn't going to consume on that day, then I would have to be organized. I'd have to say, well, I can't do my shopping that day. I need to do my shopping another day. And I need to know that I've got the things I need for that day. If I'm having someone over for dinner, I need to make sure the food's bought the day before. That kind of thing. Requires intentionality. So I think there's a way for us to work through these ideas and say, what does it mean, culturally in the world? But also, what does it mean for me? What's going on in me? Why do I react to, actually, I don't want to do that? Well, it's because I quite like the idea of actually just being able to pop to the shops and do what I want and all of those kind of things. So I'm not suggesting to you that you have to do that. Please, this is a grace, not a burden. But for some of us, maybe that's something that we want to think about. I want to pray for us. I'm going to read a quick scripture. Jonathan's going to help us finish with a song. I used this verse last week. I think it's at the core of what it means for us to embrace any idea of Sabbath. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Father, in all this talk of Sabbath, we can find ourselves so quickly adding burdens to our already burdened lives. We want to come to you. We want to come to Jesus and recognize the gift of rest. We want to take your yoke upon us and learn from you, in order that we may truly find rest for our souls. Help us, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen.